Today we'll be talking about leadership transition in East Asia and the United States. We'll be talking about Taiwan, where recently voters just re-elected President Ma Ying-jeou for a second term. President Ma's supporters are praise him for reducing the tensions with China, but his critics are worried that his China-friendly policies are eroding Taiwan's sovereignty. We'll also be talking about China, which is poised for a rather remarkable, rather unprecedented leadership transition in the fall. We'll likely be seeing a new president and a new premier. We'll see 7 of the 9 seats on the nation's most powerful decision-making body, the Standing Committee, are set to change hands. There's going to be turnover in the State Council, Military Commission, a lot of interesting things going on there. So we'll probably today we'll want to discuss how these changes will affect the United States. And now in the United States, we have the Obama administration talking about a pivot in U.S. Foreign affairs towards Asia. We're also hearing a lot of kind of chest-thumping rhetoric from the frontrunner, Republican frontrunner in that race, Mitt Romney, who's talking about slapping trade tariffs on Chinese imports on the first day of he's in office if he gets elected. So indeed, there's a lot to talk about, and we have a great panel today. I'll introduce everyone. We have Stephen Goldstein. Sophia Smith, Professor of Government at Smith College. He's also the director of the Taiwan Workshop at the Fairbanks Center at Harvard University. And this spring, he's serving as the James Van Buren Visiting Distinguished Professor at the Naval War College. And then next up, we have Mary Gallagher, an associate professor of political science at Michigan. She's also the director of the Center for Chinese Studies. And her research interests include Chinese politics, comparative politics of transitional and developing states, and law and society. And then next up, we have John Ciociari, an assistant professor at the Ford School of Public Policy here at Michigan. His current research projects include or focus primarily on the Asia-Pacific region and examine foreign policy strategies, human rights, and the reform of international economic institutions. And finally, we have Karis Templeman, just received his PhD in political science here at the University of Michigan, and he will be a Weiser Research Fellow for the 2012-2013 academic year. His primary research interests include democratization, party system development in newly contested regimes, and political institutions, with a special focus on the states of East and Southeast Asia.
You might have guessed I'm to talk about Taiwan, where there's been no transition, but there has been a considerable number of sighs of relief all over East Asia, but specifically in Beijing and in Washington. It was not the case that both Beijing and Washington remained silent during this election or failed to express their preferences. China was very clear on what its preferences were. While it didn't rise to the level of 2000 when there were threats against Taiwan, nor did it rise to the level of 1995-96 when there were military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. It was very clear from statements that were made by the Taiwan office of the State Council that if the opposition candidate, Tsai Ing-wen, was elected, that there would be a serious decline in the nature of cross-strait relations, and specifically the economic aspects of cross-strait relations would not go forward. So it was no coincidence that on the eve of the election, a number of prominent Taiwan industrialists came out in support of Ma Ying-jeou. So the mainland made its position very clear. The United States also, in more subtle ways, made its position very clear. In September, when Tsai Ing-wen was here, There was a leak to the Financial Times that the United States was not confident that she, in fact, was capable of managing the cross-strait relationship. And on the eve of the election, a government representative, which was very unusual from the United States, an official of the United States government, visited Taiwan. And again, it was very clear where the United States was inclining towards whom they would favor in the election. So what you had was what you really had during the Chen Shui-bian era, converging interests between the United States and China. Similar interests that converged on a similar policy. And I think it's pretty clear to me at least, that as was the case during the Chen Shui-bian era, that Beijing looked to the United States to handle the Taiwan question. For that reason, I think that and their knowledge of the backlash that could happen if they intervened very strongly, it was for that reason that you had the very subtle position, but very clear position taken by Beijing. So we've got Ma Ying-jeou as president, everyone's sighing a sigh of relief. There will be no more cross-strait crises. I want to explore that possibility for a second, and I want to begin it by going back to the Chen Shui-bian administration. There were two very important things that happened between 2000 and 2008. The first very important thing was that the people on Taiwan realized that independence, de jure independence, because they already have de facto independence, but de jure independence was simply not an option. Chen Shui-bian flirted with the idea of trying to apply to the UN under the name of Taiwan. Chen Shui-bian talked about changing the constitution, and he practically domestically failed at every turn. But more important than that, for the first time in a long time, probably the first time since the Eisenhower administration and John Foster Dulles, the United States leaned on Taiwan very heavily to change its policies, this time its policies towards independence. So what you had from 2000 to 2008 was a removal of the independence option. The people of Taiwan realized, and I think all politicians on Taiwan realized, that that's going nowhere. If Taiwan declares independence, it will not only probably not be recognized by any more than the 20-odd states that now recognize it, it would lose TECO representation in the over, I think, 70 or 80 states where it has this unofficial office. Because you would have to convert that into an embassy. China would not accept 2 embassies. States would have to choose, and it wouldn't be much of a choice. As far as the mainland was concerned, in December of 2008, President Hu Jintao, at a speech for the 30th anniversary of the message to the compatriots of 1978, gave 6 points, or listed 6 points for the future of cross-strait relations. And one of them was that both sides should strive for peaceful development in the period before unification. Now, those 6 points, plus what had been said during the last years of the Chen Shui-bian administration, made it very clear that as far as the mainland was concerned, for the short term, they would not press for reunification, that in the short term, for the short term, the objective of mainland policy would be to prevent the independence of Taiwan and would pursue a policy in the meantime, before reunification, of trying to increase cross-strait relations. So to a certain extent, or to a great extent, both sides accepted status quo. Both sides accepted status quo of neither unification nor independence, at least in the short run. The question becomes, what about the long run? Taiwan, and I think I won't use the slides that I have up, but it's very clear that public opinion in Taiwan is not such and is unlikely to be such within the next decade or two for favoring any kind of reunification or confederation or whatever you call it with the mainland. It's very clear that public opinion in Taiwan is oriented towards maintenance of the status quo, but with increased and continued economic contacts. It's very clear. I met with the president and some of his advisors the day after the election, and we talked about where this was going to go next, what the next step would be for Taiwan. And what his advisors said and what the president himself said was, look, we've got lots of things to do. We've got lots of economic agreements that we have to negotiate with the mainland. We've got cultural agreements. And they went on with this long list of agreements that and issues that had to be discussed with the mainland, none of which touched on political questions, none of which touched on really the essence of the relationship. And it was very clear that as far as Taiwan is concerned, for the next 4 years at least, and I would guess for the next 10 years at least, they're going to try to stretch out this process, keep the relationship going, keep it on grounds that Taiwan public opinion will accept, and that's culture and economics, and simply play for time. If you want to use a basketball analogy, it's just a stall. They're going to keep bringing up new issues, new economic issues, new cultural issues, and avoid foreign policy, and avoid political issues. Now, what's the mainland response going to be? So far, everything coming out of the mainland, coming out of the Taiwan and coming out of the Taiwan Yenjoso, has been geared towards, we accept that. We accept the fact that there will be a long period where we will build economic ties, build cultural ties, and hopefully provide the basis for mutual trust that can then become the basis for more politically oriented agreements, such as confidence building measures, such as maybe a peace agreement, what have you. That is what's coming out of officials. But there has, in the last, since the election, in the last month or two, comments by people like General Lo Yuan, who's a hardliner, who's a commentator, and Lo Yuan has been warning for the last 4 years that Taiwan is pursuing a policy of peaceful separation, hoping Fanya, and that the mainland has to be aware of the fact that Taiwan's going to stall. And Lo Yuan published an article a couple days ago in the Hong Kong press where he said precisely that. Sun Zhi, whom some of you may know, who's head of the American Institute at Tsinghua University, a Columbia PhD. Sun Zhi recently wrote a piece where he said fundamentally the same thing, that this can't go on indefinitely. Now, of course, the mainland has taken the indefinitely out of their policy, seen a dime. That was in the earlier white paper. But if we look to the future, and if we look to the new leadership, which I think people are going to talk about, the question that I think you have to ask is, for how long will Beijing allow the cross-strait relations to be restricted to cultural and economic affairs? And at what point will pressures build up within the leadership for whatever reason to resolve the Taiwan question? Because for the moment, I think if you view the situation from Beijing, it's going to require an enormous amount of patience over the next decade or two in dealing with the Taiwan issue, and a readiness to accept very little progress in the political realm, in the hope that they'll build up constituencies on Taiwan, as well as business ties that will provide the basis then for a political relationship. And what the slides I was going to show would have shown was that in public opinion surveys on Taiwan, there's absolutely no substantiation for the argument that Taiwan opinion is changing as more favorable to China. It remains maintenance of status quo. It remains distrustful. So in the short run, I think it's good news. In the short run, status quo will continue. Economic and cultural ties will continue. The question is, in the long run, as these ties continue, whether or not Taiwan, which I doubt, might try to substantiate them into different kinds of relations with the world, not China. And Taiwan might become, and the mainland might become impatient that Taiwan is simply playing for time. So that's the non-transition.
Much of what I have to say today actually dovetails nicely with what Stephen was talking about. I'm going to focus more on the actual election itself in Taiwan and how it played out. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the implications of that for cross-strait relations going forward, and also implications for Taiwan's democracy itself, the consolidation of Taiwan's party system, and the continuation of multi-party competition going forward. So the presidential election in Taiwan was held in January 2012, so it's been a little over 2 months since the election. And of course, the incumbent candidate was Ma Ying-jeou of the KMT, and he's eligible to run for a second term during this election, second and final term. He faced off against Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP's nominee for the presidency. And it's worth noting a couple things about Tsai Ing-wen's background. Both she and Ma actually hold advanced degrees from English-speaking countries. Ma, of course, went to Harvard for graduate school, and Tsai Ing-wen both got a law degree from Cornell University, and then went on to get a PhD from Oxford University. So both of the candidates actually shared a similar background. And this is kind of a departure, especially from the candidates that the DPP has run in the past. They've tended not to have the same kind of international experience. And the foreign press often notes that when Ma Ying-jeou, for instance, was running in his first election, that he spoke much better English than the other candidates. And so in this election, for once, the DPP candidate actually, I think, matched up well with the KMT candidate in that kind of international perspective. The major issues in the campaign really were two. One that cropped up a lot is cross-strait relations, and in particular, the signing by the Ma administration of an economic cooperation framework agreement with the PRC. And as Professor Goldstein was mentioning, there's a lot of things involved in this that are continuing to play out, and it's basically an agreement to continue to work on implementing other kinds of cross-strait exchanges, cultural and economic. But the main issue that really drove the campaign on a day-to-day basis was the economy. And this is a bit of a departure as well for Taiwanese campaigns. So Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP played up the fact that Taiwan has had rising inequality under the Ma administration, especially pointing to soaring housing costs in the urban centers in Taiwan and a decline of blue-collar job opportunities. A lot of primary production has moved to China, and so folks who were originally employed in those industries have lost out. Also notable here was that symbolic issues such as changing the Constitution or trying to get Taiwan into the UN again, were not a big issue during this election. The DPP in part focused more on economic issues rather than these symbolic issues that they've often tried to play up in the past. And so those things kind of set this campaign apart from campaigns in 2004 and 2000 in particular. Of course, once the vote was held, Ma Ying-jeou came out with a little over majority, 51.6%. Tsai Ing-wen ended up with about a little under 46%. So a much closer election, actually, than the 2008 election, in which the ratio was 59-41. The KMT won that election in a landslide. And so the numbers become much closer to two-party parity here. At the same time that there was a presidential election, there was also a legislative election. And this is also new in Taiwan. For the first time, they've held them on the same day in conjunction with one another. And so that actually allows you to look at party strength versus candidate strength, something we can talk about in the Q&A perhaps. But the main result here was that the KMT maintained their majority in the legislature. So they lost a few seats relative to where they were in 2008, but they still retained at least 55% of the vote, of the seats. The DPP recovered from their disastrous performance in 2008 and actually bumped up their vote share quite a bit, and also won actually 13 additional seats in that election. And then a couple other small parties that are part of the larger coalitions of the DPP and their splinter parties and the KMT and theirs. The Taiwan Solidarity Union with the DPP actually won a couple seats and returned to the legislature. And the PFP, which is a KMT splinter party, also won a couple seats and returned to the legislature. And both of these parties had been, well, at least the TSU had been completely shut out until then. And so there's actually more diversity, more parties within the new legislature than within the old. I would call this, and I think I'm agreeing here with Professor Goldstein, that this is really a status quo election. There's no leadership transition to talk of here. But I want to kind of push back against a common narrative that's in the media that describes, that relates this election result. And that is that a lot of the narratives coming out of this election suggested that that Ma's re-election was really a mandate for closer political ties with China, and that the fact that he won re-election was an endorsement of everything that had come before in cross-strait relations. And I don't think it's obvious at all that cross-strait things like the ECFA actually contributed to Ma's re-election. First off, Ma was always a favorite for re-election. When you win 59% of the vote to come into office, you start out with that coalition. And so over 4 years, he would have had to lose a large chunk of that coalition in order to lose re-election. And then second, his campaign actually, we talk about this in political science a lot, one of the best predictors of your re-election chances is how the economy is doing in the previous year. And his campaign actually benefited quite a lot from favorable economic conditions. And so if I show you over the 4 years of the Ma administration, Ma enjoyed economic growth when he first came to office in mid-2008. Then there was a recession in 2009, corresponding to the global recession and the housing crisis in the US, then the larger financial crisis in Europe. But then Taiwan had a remarkable recovery in 2010, and so you can see that there's quite a surge in economic growth throughout 2010 into 2011, and luckily for Ma, the election was right here. And so there's strong economic performance leading up into this election, and so it would have been very, very surprising if the DPP, despite this pattern over the last 2 years, had managed to pull out a victory in this presidential race. And so, again, I want to emphasize that I think this is more a story about simple economics and economic growth rather than either a mandate or closer political relations with China or a rejection of long-term independence for China, for Taiwan relative to China. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that Tsai Ing-wen, although she lost this election, really presided over a pretty remarkable recovery of the DPP. So the DPP in 2008 got crushed in this election. It was a disastrous performance, and they were often, in many voters' minds, the party was associated with the Chen Shui-bian administration, which by that point had become extremely unpopular. It was polling below 10% in approval ratings. And so Tsai was a new face on the scene and slowly and pretty systematically built up a more moderate image for the DPP and won several by-elections, won a bunch of local elections. And so 4 years later, the DPP is actually in much better shape than it was in 2008, despite having lost this presidential election. And so if you look just at the legislature, the KMT still looks like it has a very large majority here. But if you look specifically at vote share won in district elections in Taiwan, you can see the DPP has actually pretty steadily increased its performance in district elections in legislative races. And so traditionally they fared very poorly in these relative to the KMT. What the 2012 election suggests is that both the KMT and the DPP are approaching parity in kind of generic party strength. And so going forward, the KMT is not going to start out with a large advantage in these races. And so it looks to me like there's a consolidation of the party system around two major parties, and we're likely to see competitive races going forward. This is not a long-term KMT triumph in this election. So to wrap up, I just want to draw a couple of implications for cross-strait relations. The first is just expect more of the same of what's happened over the last 4 years. On the economics side, I would expect continued pragmatic changes in increased economic ties with the PRC. But on the political side, and again, I'm agreeing with Professor Goldstein here, I don't expect to see much movement by the Ma administration at all, precisely because public opinion constrains the Ma administration's ability to move. And even though Ma is not up for re-election in 4 years, there will be a KMT successor who will be. And the DPP still poses a potent electoral challenge to the KMT. So they simply don't have the electoral flexibility to move and to move out ahead of public opinion. And second, I would say, rather surprisingly, given how Taiwan often pops up at inopportune times in U.S.-China relations, I actually expect the Taiwan issue to be eclipsed by other issues in the PRC-U.S. relationship over the next year. And so Taiwan is kind of, I think, going to fall by the wayside a little bit. We'll hear a lot more about things like China's allegedly undervalued currency or trading imbalances and that kind of thing.
I'm going to talk today about the mainland, about the PRC, and I'm going to really focus on some domestic issues that China will be facing in the next decade of this new leadership. And first, I'm just going to describe a little bit about what's happening, what kind of changes will be coming up in the fall, and then talk about these challenges, and at the end, relate them to policymaking in China. So we know that in the fall of 2012, there will be the 18th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, and this will mean a number of things for the Chinese political system. First, there will be massive turnover in personnel, particularly at the highest levels of party government and the military. And Li Cheng, a political scientist at the Brookings Institution, estimates that at the highest levels of the party, that's the Politburo Standing Committee, the Central Military Commission, and the State Council, which is within the PRC government, there'll be 70% turnover. So this is really unprecedented amount of turnover in the PRC political system probably since the Cultural Revolution. The Party Congress will do a number of different things in addition to this turnover. They'll also set some guiding policies, sort of look back at the last 10 years of leadership, but also set some guiding policies for going forward. There may be revisions to key party documents, such as the Constitution. In a previous Party Congress, for example, the Constitution was amended to allow private entrepreneurs into the party. So there could be sort of a major revision to the Constitution of the party. But very little about what will happen is known in advance. Right now, even we don't know when exactly the Party Congress will happen. The date will be set later in the summer. So a lot of it is speculation, and a lot of it is sort of rumor and innuendo, but a very important transition nonetheless. The Politburo Standing Committee is the top body of the Chinese Communist Party. This will undergo the most significant turnover. 7 members of the Politburo will step down, including the current party secretary, Hu Jintao, and the premier of the government, Wen Jiabao. It's widely expected that Xi Jinping, whose picture he's met Obama when he visited last month, will be promoted to lead the party, become party secretary, and then president of the country. Li Keqiang will be the premier. The other 7 slots of the Politburo Standing Committee will be taken by new members. So 7 of these people will, if you can see it, it's a little small, will step down mainly because of age, and they will be replaced by younger party officials. I want to just say in regards to China's political institutionalization and reform, we often say that China hasn't done enough political reform compared to its economic reform. One major change that happened in the 1980s is that the retirement of party officials and government officials became very systematic. And so we can assume that people, as they reach 68, are going to be ending their political careers or taking less meaningful roles. And this is something that's very different from the Mao era. So in regards to political reform, this is a major political reform that China did. We can now know that most of these older party officials will step down. So now I want to turn to some of the economic and social challenges that this new government will be dealing with as they take office in the fall. The economic challenges that China faces these days are really because of its success over the last 30 years. So massive economic growth, very high rates of millions of people leaving poverty, and economic development at a rate that we haven't seen in other countries, even in other fast developing economies in Asia, like Taiwan earlier, South Korea, Japan. And so I just want to talk just very briefly, in 2 minutes, I guess, about these economic challenges. The first challenge that you hear a lot talked about in the press is this need to rebalance away from investment-driven growth. And this is particularly the case since the 2008 financial crisis, where the Chinese government stepped in with a massive stimulus program to keep its economy growing at a relatively rapid rate, but mainly through government investment. So the government invested huge amounts in the economy to keep things moving along. So this is from the World Bank report that was just issued last month. It's a very good read, although it's 468 pages. But you can see here they try to estimate going forward what will happen. But you can see at the current period, the investment, government investment as a ratio to GDP is almost 50%, and so kind of an unsustainable amount of investment, leading to these high rates of growth. The other Another issue is, and this is more of a local government issue in China, Chinese local governments have become extremely dependent on land revenue, redevelopment of land for commercial reasons, for their own fiscal reasons, for their own budgets. And this is creating this is part of the reason of the imbalanced economy, because this investment is often local, but it's also creating a lot of social friction in China, a lot of conflict between farmers and local governments, and of course leading to a lot of wasteful development. The third issue is, it's a good issue, it's a positive thing that's happened in China for Chinese workers, but it's creating stress in coastal economies on the Chinese coast, the development zones around Shanghai and around Guangdong in the south. Wages are going up very rapidly in China among labor-intensive manufacturing workers, and many factories and companies are moving investment either to inland China or to Southeast Asia or to other places that have lower costs. Now, this is good for, you can imagine, this is very good for other goals, because if Chinese consumers have more to consume, then this imbalancing issue will be corrected. But this leads to the issue for coastal economies: what's going to replace these labor-intensive manufacturing jobs? What kind of economies will Guangzhou have now? Will Shanghai have? Will Jiangsu have? As labor-intensive manufacturing moves to other places. So again, these are very big economic challenges, but they come on the heels of 30 years of success. And so there's a lot of momentum in solving them successfully. And just one last issue that I don't have on that chart, but I want to mention because it's in here too. Urbanization in China is happening at the fastest rate in human history. I think the World Bank calculates that this is like one new Tokyo every year for the next 20 years. So massive amounts of people moving to urban areas. So right now, share of employment in agriculture is almost 40%. By 2030, they estimate it will go down to 12%. I'm probably running out of time, so I should stop soon.
A few more minutes.
Okay. The social challenges are of course related to these economic issues, and the social challenges are also very pressing. In terms of urbanization, what urbanization means is creating social welfare programs that encompass a larger number of Chinese citizens, but also that have deeper coverage. Right now, China has extended medical insurance and pension insurance to rural citizens, but it's very, very shallow. The coverage rate is actually very high. It's over 90%, but what you get out of those insurance plans is very small. And so the national government, the central government, is trying, I think, very hard to figure out ways to develop social welfare programs that are comprehensive, that don't discriminate between urban citizen, migrant worker, rural citizen, reducing inequality. But there is a lot of resistance at local levels, because local areas, cities, and provinces will have to actually implement these policies, which are redistributive. They're going to take money from wealthy people and redistribute it to poorer people. And related to the land problems that I just mentioned in terms of the dependence of local governments on land redevelopment for fiscal revenue, this is leading to these kinds of situations in rural areas and in suburban areas, where farmers who don't own their land are having the land taken away by the local government, sold to developers, the farmers are compensated at a lower rate than they think is fair, and then the land is sold off at high value. This is creating enormous tension in local areas in China, probably even more so than labor unrest, which is something I study, but this kind of unrest is very severe. And there are very few institutions actually to deal with this kind of unrest. So it often ends up being handled at the last minute through some kind of police security force, rather than setting out a new way to compensate farmers for the land that they've been using. Again, it's a really big issue that is facing the government. And so to talk just in conclusion about, so these policy challenges are extremely significant. They're very serious. They're in a way partly because Chinese reforms have been so successful for the last 30 years. The World Bank report, which was written with the Chinese government, sort of recognizes that this type of reform policies that we've had have been successful, but now we need to change to a new kind of economic system, one that's more domestic-driven, one that's more equitable across regions and across different types of people, but very significant challenges. This is in the context of a leadership transition in China that is very non-transparent and is not democratic, which makes it hard to know what the preferences of these new leaders are. And this is a question going forward, what will their policy preferences be? You know, of course, we hear ad nauseum what our candidates right now, what their policy preferences are, although I think Mitt Romney always lies about his policy preferences, so it's almost as bad as it being non-transparent, since you don't really know what he thinks, but that's just, I had to criticize the Republicans just once in my talk. But I want to say something just in closing about what this means for these policy challenges going forward. Because this transition is non-transparent and a very slow transition in reality, there's a lot of holdovers in terms of the people who have retired. They have a lot of power even after they step down. The new leadership is unlikely to make bold policy decisions in the first few years of office. That really, if they're going to make a significant change, if they can make a significant change, it won't be right away. And this is different than what we might think in a US presidential election, where there's a honeymoon period where the new president comes in, he has the goodwill, he has the votes behind him, and he can try to push through a lot of changes right away. This doesn't happen in the Chinese system. So consolidation will come first, and then perhaps some more significant policy changes, probably 3 or 4 years, or maybe 5 years down the line. So in conclusion, I would say we estimate probably very few. It's very unlikely that we'll see large policy shifts at the beginning of the new leadership. Political reform, significant political reform, is very unlikely. They've said outright democratic transition is, of course, unlikely, but even more so because of what's happened in the Middle East, where it does seem that democratic transitions in other places around the world are happening in a way that's hard to predict, and that also seem to come because of a small crisis that gets blown up into a major political transformation. And this has made the Chinese government very worried. Which leads to this issue of very rapid social change in China continuing to happen. Political reform and political institutions are changing more slowly. And I think the Chinese government faces the danger of not keeping up with social changes and social demands. And this is even related to Taiwan. This is something Professor Goldstein raised, where public opinion on the mainland may be becoming more nationalistic towards Taiwan, putting more pressure on the government. And the government is having a hard time dealing with when public opinion shifts very quickly. The political institutions in China are not well managed to kind of absorb public opinion shifts. So, thank you.
So I've got a few different things I'd like to cover. First, I want to provide a sense of the baseline or the medium-term elements of continuity in U.S. policy toward East Asia broadly. Secondly, to briefly mention what candidate Barack Obama said prior to his election in 2008. Thirdly, to discuss a little bit what President Obama has done in office in terms of adjusting U.S. policy toward Asia, the pivot that Bill referred to in particular. Fourth, what is the current Republican frontrunner Mitt Romney saying? And fifth, how likely is it that he will actually follow the policies that he's currently espousing, and what would that mean for U.S. relations with Asia? So I'll spend a few minutes on each of those. First, the baseline or the continuities in U.S. policy toward East Asia. They're quite strong, stronger certainly than they are for many other regions of the world. And every U.S. president in the post-Cold War era, starting with Bush Sr., both Clinton administrations, both Bush Jr. administrations, and President Obama have outlined in their national security strategies an architecture for U.S. engagement with East Asia that looks very similar. And that architecture starts with and is built upon a quote-unquote foundation of the bilateral alliance networks with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines. The second item that has been continuously part of the national security strategy has been to engage with what President Obama calls other quote-unquote centers of influence, and they have been referred to differently across administrations, but essentially refers to important non-allies of the United States. Right now, the three that are listed in the president's strategy are China, Russia, and India. Those have varied a bit from point to point, but the primacy of bilateral relationships in U.S. strategy has been clear from administration to administration. The third item in these policies has been UN institutions, global institutions, be they security or economic. This could include the World Bank or IMF. Fourth has come ad hoc, flexible partnerships, things like the current Trans-Pacific Partnership or the trilateral dialogues involving, say, the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Only fifth in the list have come regional institutions, bodies such as APEC, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the newer East Asia Summit, and so forth. And so there is a strong continuity in terms of the structure of U.S. engagement in the region, and I would argue that while the Obama administration has departed from that slightly, it really is only a slight departure, and that fundamental approach to East Asian relations remains largely intact. So what did President Obama say before he was elected as a candidate? Largely because of the recession, and as a result of the recession, the decline in the size of the trade deficit for a brief period between the U.S. and China, Sino-U.S. relations weren't as large or central a part of the 2008 election as they might have been. Nevertheless, candidate Obama set forth some principles on what he would do in office. And to the extent that they differed from the policy of the second Bush administration, that change was very modest. President Obama certainly did not identify China as a strategic competitor the way that President George W. Bush had in 2001, but the policies that he enumerated in 2008, such as working with China toward currency reform, intellectual property, human rights, non-traditional security challenge, and building what was undeniably a difficult relationship, were largely continuities from the second Bush administration, which had shifted its focus back toward Asia to some extent during the latter years of the Bush presidency, and that, as you all know, had also adjusted its tune as the neoconservatives of the early Bush years became replaced by more pragmatic, let's call them paleoconservatives. And so by the time that Obama took office, in 2009, U.S. policy had already settled into something that doesn't look terribly different to what we have today. There have been a few features that the Obama administration has pointed to as evidence of its pivot to Asia. One of these has certainly been, a high-profile one, has been to join regional multilateral institutions or legal instruments. So the United States, since 2009, has joined the East Asia Summit. That was previously an Asian-only forum created in 2004, and in many ways a kind of successor to the idea that Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad had put forward in the 90s of an East Asia Economic Caucus. The United States also signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with its core of ASEAN members, which had long been a sticking point because certain of its provisions would limit the extent to which the United States could park nuclear-armed submarines or other naval vessels in Southeast Asian ports. It was seen by the Obama administration and also by many of its Asian counterparts as a signal that the United States was increasingly willing to play by the rules of the game and also wanted to be part of all of the major regional institutions, including the EAS. So the United States also hosted APEC last year. Now, that wasn't something the Obama administration planned. It's something that was in the cards a decade ago. Nevertheless, the combination of these things has been a prominent part of the administration's strategy, led by Secretary of State Clinton, to show that the United States is not solely going to rely on bilateral structures, but is going to try to beef up what I described to you as that fifth prong in U.S. strategy of multilateral engagement. At the same time, the United States has also done a number of things to show that its departure is not terribly great from what I've described as the medium-term practice of U.S. foreign policy in Asia. Secretary Clinton had said, in addition to saying that the U.S. is back in Asia after the resources being poured into Afghanistan and Iraq, she also offended China in 2010 by saying the United States had a national interest in what was going on in the South China Sea, where China and some of its Southeast Asian neighbors are feuding over Spratly and Paracel Islands and some of the mineral resources or energy resources that lie beneath, as well as the fisheries. Last year, in front of the Council on Foreign Relations, Secretary Clinton said, for the first time to my knowledge, an open acknowledgement that, yes, in some respects, the United States and China are competing strategically. And so, again, veering back toward a policy that looks a fair amount like the latter part of the Bush administration. The United States has also taken a number of steps to shore up its defense perimeter in the Asia-Pacific. 2,500 Marines have been moved to a base at Darwin on the northern coast of Australia. The United States has been working with the Japanese to relocate some Marines in Okinawa, which is seen as a manner of solidifying that presence in Okinawa and making it more durable in the decades ahead. The United States has agreed with the Thai military to be able to use certain Thai facilities as a hub for conducting military humanitarian operations. The United States has its largest ever joint naval exercise with the Philippines next month off of Palawan, which is adjoining the South China Sea area that is disputed between China and its neighbors. And I could go on. There are a number of other things that the United States has been doing in the past few years that has given many people, not least of which the Chinese government, the impression that the United States pivot to Asia looks a bit like a form of gentle or containment. Some say not so gentle. Is that pivot particularly new or surprising? I don't think so. I think, as I mentioned to you, that by the latter years of the Bush administration, the foreign policy establishment in this country believed that the U.S. had spent much too much of its resources militarily and politically in the Middle East. Where the big moving pieces was in East Asia, and therefore there was a gradual sort of flow back in that direction toward the latter years of Bush and in President Obama's administration. What about these, as Bill described them, chest-thumping things that candidate Mitt Romney has been saying on the campaign trail? He said that he's going to get tough on China in a variety of ways, and I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons for him doing that is he wants to outflank President Obama to say that President Obama is allowing China to run the table on the United States interests in Asia, economically, strategically, and otherwise, and if elected, Mitt Romney will arrest that development. On day one, Mitt Romney says, "I will name China a currency manipulator," which is a special code word under U.S. law. If that word appears in a foreign exchange report to Congress under the 1988 Omnibus Trade Act, the administration then has authority to pursue remedies such as countervailing duties, to go to the WTO, and Romney is saying, I'm going to get tough on China. He argues, I don't want a trade war, but nor do I want a trade surrender. And so this is a very clear shot across the bow that on the issue that Karis mentioned is likely to be the most high-profile issue in the coming year of Sino-U.S. relations, candidate Romney is saying, I'm going to get tough. Secondly, candidate Romney says that he will reverse the military spending cuts that President Obama has just included in his latest negotiations with Congress on that matter. And while President Obama is cutting defense spending by a few percent, including cutting some expenses on shipbuilding and on new types of aircraft and missile defense systems and other things that are the types of new military resources that would most likely feature in any conceivable conflict with China, candidate Romney says, I'm not going to let that happen. If you elect me, I'm going to set a floor on U.S. defense spending at 4% of GDP, and I'm going to increase the size of the U.S. military by 100,000 troops. And in particular, I'm going to make sure that some of the funds that I replenish go toward the types of strategic needs that are foreseeable in a possible Asian conflict. So both on the economic and on the security side, talking tough. Candidate Romney has also said, if elected president, I will be much tougher than the Obama administration on Chinese rights violations. He's referred to the one-child policy as barbaric. He has referred to a number of other things the Chinese government has done domestically as serious infringements on basic human liberties, and saying, if elected, I will support Chinese dissidents and values of freedom, human rights, and democracy. So across the board, candidate Romney is saying, I'm going to make a significant change or departure from President Obama. In the last minute that I've got, let me tell you how much I think that that's likely to be the case. If elected, President Romney, or Mitt Romney, would be highly, highly constrained. One of his major constituencies would be business leaders. Business leaders, by and large, have not been in favor of initiating stern trade actions against China. Secondly, this notion of bolstering the alliances on the military side with some of America's Asian allies. Romney has said both he wants to strengthen alliances and he wants to create in East Asia what he calls a, quote, Reagan economic zone of like-minded liberal market democracies. That idea was advanced during the Bush administration. Asian countries, by and large, rejected it. They don't want to be part of a containment ring around China, which is seen as unduly provocative. Candidate Romney, if elected, is likely to face the same constraints. And therefore, my conclusion would be that if in fact Romney is elected president and replaces Obama, that we're more likely to see strong continuities in U.S. policy with perhaps modest adjustments. For example, perhaps a few more sensitive items being sold to Taiwan, perhaps a few more troops involved in naval exercises, perhaps a little bit more bluster in relationship on the currency issue. But I don't expect anything approximating the policy change that candidate Romney is now talking about on the stump. I think that what we'll see is that we'll converge back toward what has been, as I said at the outset, a relatively steady U.S. policy toward East Asia in the past couple of administrations. Thanks.
You know, John mentioned at the tail end of his talk about the arms sales, and I wanted to ask Stephen Karras about that. You didn't get a chance to get into that, but that's a kind of a perennial kind of irritant in the relationship between China and the U.S. With kind of an easing of tensions with President Ma in Taiwan. Is that what's the status of the arms sales now?
Oh, okay. That continues to be the single policy by the United States that could cause serious damage to Sino-American relations in regard to the Taiwan question. The Chinese, there's been a subtle shift in the Chinese position on arms sales. It used to be for the last decade that, of course, there weren't that many arms sales during there were none during the Chen Shui-bian administration except at the beginning. But the Chinese statements on arms sales were always to condemn the United States and not Taiwan. Recently, that policy has changed. They're beginning to become critical of Taiwan for buying arms, for upsetting the good mood of cross-strait relations. President Ma has said that he will continue to buy arms because that gives Taiwan a position of strength when dealing with the mainland. So for the moment, I don't think there are any major arms sales on the docket, but they will come up during the next 4 years, and I think we can expect that to be the cause of considerable unhappiness on the mainland and some increase in tensions between the United States and the mainland.
I would just add that packages that have already been approved, Taiwan has had trouble getting funding to actually buy the packages. And so there's talk in Taiwan this year, actually, of delaying purchases of already approved F-15 and F-16 sales. And so I don't think that domestic constraint, the preference of the legislature to allocate those funds to something else is going to change anytime soon. And so Taiwan is in effect kind of moving away from a full-throated defense, a full dedication to its own defense, and relying more and more heavily, I think, on the implicit U.S. security umbrella and on warmer relations with the PRC.
Anyone else?
I guess I'll add one thing on that, and that is that, building on what you said, Karis, I don't think that either the United States government or the Taiwanese government perceives these arms sales as a means of allowing Taiwan to necessarily defend itself against a motivated PRC in a conflict. What this is it's a manner of providing some political leverage in the negotiations so that Taiwan is able either to elongate, as a few of the panelists said, or to forestall movement toward greater political integration. So it is symbolically important. It will irritate relations, but I don't think that the difference between U.S. weapons, the new F-16s, or just repairing the old ones, will have any significant effect on Taiwan's ability to prevail in conflict.
I just have a kind of a two-part question about Taiwan and China. How good of a job is the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party, the DPP, doing in grooming the next wave of leaders with Ma, who might come after Ma, and also on the mainland too? I mean, one thing that's really interesting about the change that we're going to be seeing there is that it's not people leaving chairs; it's actually a generational change. And what's the significance of that?
Shall I take this? Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about the KMTs. The next generation, I guess, if we're going to speak in those terms, of the KMT. The KMT actually controls a majority of the county executives in Taiwan today. So that's either county executives or city mayors, and those are traditionally stepping stones to national politics. So people like Eric Zhu, who is mayor of New Taipei City now. Those folks are fairly young. They're on average in their 40s or early 50s. And so I think once Ma leaves the scene, there's a decent number of them who are going to end up vying with each other for probably the nomination in 2016. So I do think the KMT has another generation of folks coming up who aren't associated with, I should add, aren't associated with the Lee Teng-hui administration, or like Ma, associated even with the authoritarian era at all. And so this is a much more kind of pragmatic group that can leave a lot of that ideological baggage behind. And likewise, actually, I'd add in the DPP, the same thing has happened. Tsai Ing-wen is kind of the leading edge of a younger group of politicians who've come up and entered politics when Taiwan was already pretty much democratic. And so they're, like their KMT counterparts, not focused so much on these old battles. And so I think you see a much more, a move towards a more pragmatic approach in both the KMT and the DPP. And the kind of old ideological battles are kind of fading away as this old generation passes from the scene.
So about the PRC, I think I want to make a couple of points about how we think about leadership change in China and generational change in particular. I think prior to the Hu Jintao administration coming into office 10 years ago, there was a tendency to assume that each generation will be more liberal than the last because of their experiences in the PRC, Cultural Revolution generation versus some other generation. And that didn't really prove to be true. It doesn't seem that there is this connection between youth and liberalism or tendency for more reform. And I think the Hu Jintao government is pursued less political reform and also pursued less economic reform. And in some ways, there's been retrenchment in both areas, and that may be due to what was going on in the global economy as well. But there are differences. You can look at these generations and see clear differences. I'm going to argue that you just don't see them necessarily in their ideological or their policy preferences. So the differences really, I think, come down to the younger generations are much better educated. They are much more wealthy. They have very significant financial interests in the political system and in the current system in particular. And their overseas experiences are different than the previous generation in terms of where they've studied, if they have studied overseas, what foreign languages they speak. And education, I mean both higher education and also more diverse education. These are no longer made up only of engineers and technocrats. But like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that each generation of the PRC leadership will become more liberal, because these, even more so than the 1980s generation, this generation and the next generation have very significant financial interests and personal interests in this system staying stable and not changing significantly. I didn't say, of course, but the last picture on my slide was a picture of Bo Xilai, who some people said before the recent scandal was much more like a typical Western politician than you see, in the sense of being much more populist, pursuing policies in Chongqing that were populist and that did court public opinion to some extent. So it may be that this younger generation is not more liberal, but is becoming much more adept at politics, in the terms of politics meaning courting public opinion.
I just add one thing, that I think what is more important than the nature of the generation is the nature of the leadership, and that is that what is going to emerge in China in the future is going to be a very collective leadership. It's going to operate by consensus. Because it's going to operate by consensus, it's going to compromise at the lowest common denominator that the 9 men on the standing, and they will all be men, on the standing committee will accept. And that is a real problem for China. Because what China needs is a leadership that's capable of initiating some pretty major changes. And regardless of their personal feelings, regardless of their personal ideology, the dynamics, the group dynamics of consensus policymaking is going to be the real danger, if you will, for China in the decade ahead. They used to say in the Soviet Union during the Brezhnev period that the only way the Soviet Union could go forward would be by going backward, by the presence of a strong leader. And China is not likely to have that kind of reforming or politically strong leader in the future.
This is a question for either Mary or John. About the code word of currency manipulation that Romney is sort of advocating getting tough. I still can't figure it out. The currency rise in China would really affect anything. I mean, the only thing it's going to affect is what we buy at dollar store will be $1.25 instead of dollars. And plus, when the currency goes up, the biggest imports that China has is raw materials and energy. It will be cheaper. Could you elaborate on the whole issue as far as China is concerned, exporting and importing?
Sure.
And the currency.
Sure. Of course, it would have complicated effects if a major economy adjust the value of its currency. China's currency actually has already appreciated considerably since 2005, when the exact same issue was being debated in Washington. At that point, it was Charles Schumer and it was Lindsey Graham who were leading the charge, and it was a Republican Treasury Secretary, John Snow, and then Henry Paulson, who were opposing it. Now you have a Republican presidential candidate trying to outflank the president. I think this is mostly about politics, but first I'll answer your economic point. One possibility, as long as the United States continues to have higher investment than savings, it's a mathematical truism that we will have a current account deficit. And so if the United States continues to have a huge fiscal deficit, continues to have low levels of household savings, but continues to invest at a reasonably high level, as has been the case for a long time in this country, we will have a current account deficit, but not necessarily with China. So one possibility is that the U.S. does, in fact, U.S. consumers buy that $1.25 widget at the store, but it's made in Vietnam or India instead of China. So the bilateral trade deficit could shrink, but the overall current account deficit would remain the same, or close to it. There are also issues for a lot of American-owned businesses that operate out of China. This is sort of the little secret that one doesn't see in the political discourse in the United States. On one side are the labor unions and the manufacturers who say we have to go after China and we'll hold our politicians accountable if they allow the PRC to continue to steal our jobs and outsource them. Whether or not that's economically true, it's politically a reality in the United States discourse. But on the other side, much quieter publicly but influential privately, are business groups that go to the Treasury and the White House and the Congress and say, hey, don't tell anybody, but we're making a lot of money because we own the outfits in China that are re-exporting to the United States. This is why I don't really think that even if Romney's elected, that he will go very far on this currency issue, because he's much more identified with that constituency than he is with the labor and the manufacturing. I think this is politics. I think it's a convenient thing to beat that drum for the next 6 months, and I think that if Romney is elected, that he will say on the first day of his presidency that I've been discussing this with the Chinese and they've given me assurances that they're changing their tune, and we've set up a new strategic economic dialogue to work it out.
Sort of building off the last exchange that went on, and Dr. Goldstein's comments about there being a politics of consensus, and Mary Gallagher's comments about the new generation. And I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about the central leadership versus regional or more local dynamics. So if you have this the central level working on this politics of consensus, I know in the recent history of China, the local and regional areas are where you see real big changes that first occur, and it's a testing ground. Do you think we'll continue to see that, or there'll be a shift in that kind of model of reform and moving forward in those dynamics?
Well, the local government officials, I mean, high-level local government officials, talking about provincial or some municipalities, of course, are also within the central committee of the party. So they have this role of both representing localities, but also in the central government. And so they serve this really key role in trying to serve both constituencies, both central government and their local economies. What I see now as a major problem, and this is related to the land redevelopment and the tensions that's creating, is that local governments are still extremely motivated to grow their local economies to the detriment of any central goals that might be more rebalancing or redistributive. And so it seems to me that the central government was very successful in previous decades because their incentives were aligned with these local government incentives to grow the local economy. And local officials were successful if they did so because they would be promoted upward. And I see that as breaking down or fraying now as the central government has become more interested in other goals that include rebalancing, domestic consumption, improved labor standards, reducing environmental pollution. All of these things have been extremely hard to implement at the local level because the incentive structure is not there.
Yeah, I think that we have. I mean, the recent settlement in Guangdong province was clearly a provincial secretary who took the initiative and pursued a peaceful solution.
This is Wukan, the Wukan thing?
Yeah. Wuhan. And the other thing that comes to mind is, and Joe Fewsmith has just finished a book on this, is that there has been in the past local experimentation with different models of choosing party leaders. Not democratization, but a little more open process. That stopped. But there have been indications of experiments at different levels. But it isn't anything like the 80s when the Coast was given the go-ahead to pursue this, rapid reform policy. But as Mary says, local government financing is the key, and they have got to pay for what they do now. It's much like the U.S., where there are unfunded mandates. And so that's putting a lot of tension on them, and they're passing that on to the population by extracting funds. Which are much more difficult today because of the tax reform, particularly the agricultural tax reforms.
I'm interested in a brief history of the status of Taiwan, say over the last 200 or 300 years, and how that would feed into or support or refute China's position on what they think the long-term status of Taiwan should be.
Good question.
The last 200 or 300 years?
Briefly.
Taiwan was not ruled by Chinese until Koxinga in the middle of the 17th century. It did not become a part of Greater China until the end of the 17th century, when the Qing dynasty took it and made it a prefecture of one of the provinces, Fujian province. It remained that until the end of the 19th century, 1884-85, when it became a province of China. 10 years later, the Japanese received Taiwan in the settlement to the Sino-Japanese War. Now it gets complicated. At the Cairo meetings that preceded Tehran in 1943, President Roosevelt convinced Prime Minister Churchill that it was necessary to have China as one of the 4 world policemen, and that China would police Asia. And they issued a press communique that has absolutely no legal standing, in which they said, with the defeat of Japan, Taiwan will be returned to China. It was not a treaty, it was a press communique, and if you see the official document, it's a carbon paper. That was confirmed at Potsdam in the summer of 1945. And all the Potsdam statement said is that we reaffirm the Cairo Declaration. General MacArthur is Commander-in-Chief of forces in Asia, except the Japanese surrender in August of 1945, and designated the Republic of China to accept the surrender on Taiwan. But it was still under the jurisdiction of the United States as the commander of the Allied forces in Asia. The next event was the San Francisco Treaty of 1952, and Japan just said, we renounce all title to Taiwan. They didn't give it to anybody. And then finally, there was the agreement between, there was the treaty between Japan and the Republic of China on Taiwan, in which the same thing. It was not given to Taiwan. Japan simply renounced. This will end now. In 1991, Henry Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai. And the first thing Zhou Enlai said to him, well, one of the first things, 1971, and one of the first things Zhou Enlai said to him was recently a State Department official said that the status of Taiwan was unsettled. Is that true? Well, Kissinger didn't answer that question. He just said that if he had anything to say about it, that would never be said again by a State Department official. The official American position today is that the status of Taiwan is unsettled, and it remains that. And that's very annoying to the Chinese. But that's the position. Did that answer your question?
You didn't get into the refute or support side.
No, that's the acknowledge. That's Rensher and Chungren. I'm not going to get into that.
I'm going to cover a lot of territory pretty fast. You start out with China in dire poverty with more population than they can take care of. They do the one-child policy, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. I mean, you don't have a lot of children starving to death, so that's good. And you have the increasing economic development, and in the United States, that correlates with support for the administration. I presume that also holds for China. So my guess is that as long as they remain economically progressing, that they are not going to have to distract their population by focusing too much on Taiwan. But what I really wanted to ask is, as they shift and maintain popular support by moving to a more consumer economy, what impact that's going to have on their currency choices?
Well, one reason why, I'll answer briefly on the currency point, and others can perhaps talk about the other aspects of your question. On the currency point, the Chinese didn't, or certainly the sole reason for the Chinese currency appreciating by 20% or so vis-a-vis the dollar in the last several years is not because of U.S. pressure. It's because the Chinese government decided that it was in their economic interest to appreciate. And one reason for this is that consumers, no surprise, want the currency to be worth more so they can purchase more. China recognized, you were talking about the foreign policy implications if China had an economic hard landing, that it could try to refocus attention outward. Obviously, China wants to avoid that hard landing altogether, and one way to do that was to become less reliant on export industries, which would be subject to the vicissitudes of the world economy. And if anyone in China needed reminding not to be too dependent on exports, the global financial crisis happened, and so the People's Bank of China and others who have been agitating for reform on the currency had their hands strengthened. So I think that it's for both of those reasons, both for rebalancing the sources of growth macroeconomically, and also because consumers who are doing more purchasing want their currency to be worth more, that China has incentives to allow that to happen.
So what Romney is arguing for is going to happen anyway.
I think so. Perhaps not at the rate that would be satisfactory to a domestic political calculation, but I think over the next several years that we'll continue to see little steps incrementally for the Chinese. The Chinese don't want to revalue immediately, because if they were to signal that, then they're going to have a huge problem with speculation. And the last thing they want to do is reward a bunch of speculators who invest heavily on the underweighted currency and make a fortune. That's a real concern. They also don't want everybody in China's own banking system to take their Chinese bank deposits and park it in international financial institutions for fear that their currency values are going to be unpredictable, and therefore they want to go a very, very steady path. Those are all very reasonable policy positions, even if it's frustrating for some in the United States who perceive this as an unfair arrangement.
Well, but there are two political problems, too, because if they appreciate the renminbi, that's inflationary. And secondly, if they appreciate the renminbi, if dollars become cheaper, then people are going to try to convert their savings into dollars. And if too many people in China try to take their savings out of insolvent banks, China's going to have a problem. They're going to have to either print more money, which is inflationary, or somehow come up with the deposits that people made, which have been sunk into losing state industries. That's a political problem, too.
For Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Gallagher, you mentioned the women in China are playing a role in the political turnover that it's about to occur. I'm just wondering, do they have any role right now in the turnover in the Communist Party?
Well, I thought maybe Liu Yandong is going to get a seat. You don't think she's going to get a seat?
I doubt it, but maybe.
So right now, Wang Zheng left too, so we can't ask Wang Zheng. She's an expert in women in politics in China more than me. Right now, there is one woman who's in the Politburo who's potentially eligible for promotion to the Politburo Standing Committee, Liu Yandong. But like I said, given that it's non-transparent, it's hard to know if she has chances, and Steve thinks no. I think in most, if you measure female political participation at top levels of Chinese leadership over the reform era, it has gone down compared to the Maoist era. But that was largely because quotas were more important to keeping women in certain levels of government. So it's unclear whether it really also means that they've lost power in reality, given that they probably had limited power even then.
Okay.
Do you want to say why Liu Yandong is not going to get a seat?
No.
Okay.
Can I ask a question to Chris? So during your presentation, you talked that the Tsai candidate, she contributed to the DPP's recovery, but I want to ask you, so overall seats were also, even though the KMT maintained its ruling party, but I think the DPP really, their seats were increased a lot. So can you please analyze maybe more like any other the reasons? Maybe the DPP, they got more seats and like more votes from the people. So I heard from media that maybe people were more conservative or nationalist. So can that be a reason, or maybe, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I don't think it's a rise in conservatism or nationalism. Public opinion polling doesn't really support that. I think a big part of it is just getting rid of the baggage of Chen Shui-bian and his administration, and the fact that Chen and there was a whole cohort of DPP leaders who led the party for 20 plus years, and Chen was one among several, and they kind of traded off leadership positions within the party. Tsai was not part of that group. She actually got her start in politics in the Li Denghui administration. So this is a KMT administration in the 1990s. And after Li Denghui stepped down, then Chen Shui-bian nominated her to be, I believe, the head of the Mainland Affairs Council. And that was seen as kind of reaching out to the KMT and trying to find somebody who was nonpartisan. And so she only joined the DPP in 2004. And so for all of those reasons, she represents, also she's female. And so that represents kind of a break from this older leadership of the DPP. And so the fact that she was able to win the DPP chairmanship and then became the nominee represented a real clean break, I think. And so so that's part of it. The other part is that the DPP was she took a lot more moderate positions, or because she's a new face on the scene, she was able to kind of play down a lot of the kind of anti-China imagery that Chen Shui-bian had, for better or worse, acquired during his political career. And so she was able to kind of bring the party with her towards a more moderate position on relations with China. And so I think the DPP benefited greatly from that kind of wholesale revamping of their image over 4 years. And you see that actually in a series of elections. The DPP candidate does better by playing up local issues rather than playing up kind of nationalist issues where we're going to change the Constitution or we're going to try to get into the UN, and they were able to win elections based on economic concerns, basically.